Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains detailed descriptions of ancient funerary practices and the handling of human remains, which some may find disturbing. Imagine a 4-inch iron hook hammered into a sharp curve. Now imagine that hook being carefully, deliberately inserted through your nostril. It scrapes past the delicate cartilage, pushing deeper upward until it meets the thin, fragile bone at the roof of your sinus cavity. With a sharp tap, it punctures through, entering the dark, silent vault of the skull. And then the embalmer begins to twist. He swirls the hook around like a whisk, churning, scrambling, and liquefying the single most complex object in the known universe: your brain. This wasn't an act of torture. It was an act of salvation. This gruesome procedure was the first critical step on a 70-day journey, a sacred and terrifying ritual designed to cheat death itself. For the ancient Egyptians, life on Earth was merely a brief prelude, a short, dusty overture to the main event, an eternal existence in a paradise known as the Field of Reeds. But getting there was anything but guaranteed. It required a perfect fusion of magic, medicine, and unwavering faith. And they believed, with every fiber of their being, that if the body was lost, the soul was damned to an eternity of wandering, formless, in the void. They perfected this gruesome art over thousands of years, but one mummy, discovered just decades ago, defies everything we thought we knew. Its organs were left inside, its body contorted in agony, and it was buried with a curse so specific, it sends a chill down the spine of every archaeologist who reads it. What did this person do to deserve an eternity of torment? The answer to that question reveals a darker side to this sacred ritual, a purpose far more sinister than simply preserving the dead. To understand how they could justify such a brutal process, you have to understand how they saw the world. We, in the 21st century, often see death as a final clinical end, a light switching off. But for an Egyptian living 4,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile, death was a doorway. It was a violent, perilous transition, but a transition nonetheless. Their entire civilization, from the grandest pyramid to the simplest farmer's prayer, was built around a single, all-consuming obsession: preparing for the journey that came after. They believed a human being was composed of many parts, but 3 were essential for immortality. First, the Ka, the physical body. This was the anchor, the vessel. Second, the Ka, a person's spiritual twin, their life force, which was born with them and needed sustenance even after death. And third, the Ba, the very essence of a person's personality, their soul, often depicted as a bird with a human head, which could fly free from the body after death. Here was the cosmic problem. For a person to be reborn in the afterlife, the Ka and the Ba had to return to the Khat each night. They had to be able to recognize their former home. If the body decayed, if it rotted away into dust in the desert heat, the Ka and Ba would be lost, unable to find their anchor. The person would not just be dead. They would be unmade, ceasing to exist entirely. This was the ultimate terror: annihilation. And so mummification was born. It wasn't about creating a morbid relic for a museum. It was about crafting a permanent, recognizable home for the soul. It was an act of engineering eternity. The men who performed this sacred task were not mere undertakers. They were a class of priests, part surgeon, part shaman. They worked in a place called the Wabit, the place of purification, a workshop that was equal parts operating theater and temple, situated on the edge of the desert, where the hot winds would carry away the stench of death and decay. The chief embalmer, known as the controller of mysteries, would often wear a mask of the jackal god Anubis, the divine patron of mummification. In doing so, he wasn't just playing a role. He was channeling the god himself, becoming the divine guardian who would guide the deceased through the first steps of their journey. When a person of means died, their body was carried in a solemn procession to the Wabit. The first step was purification. The body was washed with water from the sacred Nile River, a symbol of rebirth, and palm wine, which had antibacterial properties. Priests would chant litanies and prayers, consecrating the body, preparing it for its transformation. Then the real work began. The brain, they believed, was useless. It was the source of mucus, nothing more. It had to go. So the embalmer would take that iron hook, the excerebrator, and begin the horrific process of liquefying the brain tissue. Once it was reduced to a gray slurry, the body would be tilted, and the contents of the skull would simply pour out through the nostrils. It was a messy, undignified, yet absolutely essential step. The empty cranial cavity was then rinsed with palm wine and stuffed with strips of linen to maintain the head's shape. Next came the violation of the body itself. To cut into a human form was a deeply sacrilegious act. So they had a specialist, a man called the slasher. He would use an impossibly sharp blade of obsidian or Ethiopian stone to make a single, precise incision along the left flank. According to the Greek historian Diodorus, as soon as the cut was made, the slasher would be ritually cursed by the other embalmers, who would chase him away, throwing stones. It was a performance, a way to absolve the team of the sin of desecrating a sacred vessel, placing the blame on a single scapegoat before they could continue their holy work. Through this incision, the chief embalmer would reach inside the torso. This was a moment of profound intimacy and horror. He would manually locate and remove the internal organs one by one: the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs. Each of these was considered vital for life and would be needed in the hereafter. They were individually washed, packed in a special salt called natron, and then wrapped in linen to be placed in 4 sacred containers known as canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, guarding the organs for eternity. But in the dark, wet cavity of the chest, there was one organ they dared not touch. One organ so important, so central to a person's existence, that to remove it would be to condemn them to instant, irreversible damnation. The heart. To the Egyptians, the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence, memory, and conscience. It was the living record of a person's life, and it had a final terrifying role to play. In the final judgment, deep in the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased would stand before the god Osiris. Their heart would be placed on one side of a great golden scale. On the other side, a single pure white feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was light, free from sin and deceit, it would balance with the feather, and the person would be granted eternal life in paradise. But if their heart was heavy, weighed down by a lifetime of crime, cruelty, and lies, the scale would tip. And waiting beside the scales was a monstrous creature, a terrifying hybrid of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus named Ammit, the devourer of the dead. Ammit would lunge forward and consume the heavy heart, and the soul would be utterly destroyed, cast into oblivion forever. Leaving the heart in the body was the ultimate gamble. It was a bet that the life you lived was a good one. For a pharaoh or a queen, this was the moment of truth, the point of no return in a ritual that would determine their fate for all time. The precision of the embalmer's knife, the power of his prayers, all of it was meaningless if the heart itself was corrupt. The sacred ritual for the afterlife was also the preparation for the ultimate trial. The body, now lifeless, was transported from the home of the living to a place that existed on the very threshold of the dead. It was called the Wabit, the place of purification. This wasn't a sterile white-tiled morgue. Imagine, instead, a tent or a temporary structure, built on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the setting sun, the land of the dead. The air inside would be thick with the scent of incense, natron salt, and something more primal, the smell of mortality itself. Here, a special class of priests began their solemn work. They were not just doctors or surgeons. They were ritual specialists, technicians of the sacred. The chief embalmer, known as the Eriseshta, or controller of the mysteries, was a high-ranking priest who often wore the jackal-headed mask of Anubis, the god of mummification himself. By donning the mask, he didn't just represent Anubis. In a ritual sense, he became him, channeling the god's divine authority to guide the soul safely through this perilous transition. Working under him were other specialists. The Eritep, the chief ritualist, would read the sacred texts, his voice a constant, hypnotic drone of spells and prayers that protected the body from evil spirits and sanctified each step of the process. And then there was the Wetu, the embalmer cutter. This was the man who would make the first critical incision. His role was paradoxical. He performed a necessary act of desecration to achieve a sacred preservation, and because of this, he was often ritually shunned by the community, seen as an outcast, even though his skills were essential for eternal life. The body was first laid upon a long, sloping alabaster or wooden table, designed to let fluids drain away. It was then washed. This wasn't a simple cleaning. It was a profound act of purification, a baptism with the sacred water of the Nile, symbolizing rebirth. As the water ran over the cold skin, the lector priest would recite incantations, cleansing the deceased of any earthly impurities, preparing them to enter a divine state. Then came the moment of truth. The embalmer cutter, the wetu, would take his tool. It wasn't a surgeon's scalpel. It was a flake of obsidian, a piece of volcanic glass, sharpened to a razor's edge. Stone, for the Egyptians, held a ritual purity that metal did not. With the Eri Seshta marking the correct spot on the left flank, just below the ribs, the cutter had to make a single deep, decisive slice. There was no room for error. The incision had to be perfect, a gateway into the body that was both physical and mystical. As soon as the cut was made, tradition dictated that the other priests would chase the cutter away, sometimes even throwing stones, a ritualized act of condemnation for the violence he had just committed against the body, a body that would one day be the vessel for a god. Through this opening, the internal organs were carefully, painstakingly removed. The stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs were all drawn out. To the Egyptians, these were the source of decay. Left inside, they would turn the body into a putrid, liquefying mess within days. But they were also believed to be needed in the afterlife. So they were individually washed, packed in natron salt, and anointed with fragrant oils and resins. But what about the brain? We see the brain as the seat of consciousness, of identity, of the soul. The Egyptians saw it as stuffing. They believed the heart was the center of intelligence and emotion. The brain, to them, was just the originator of mucus. So it had to go. But the skull couldn't be opened without massively disfiguring the head, which had to remain perfect for the soul to recognize it. So they devised an ingenious and frankly brutal solution. The embalmer would take a long bronze or iron hook, something like a knitting needle with a barb on the end. He would carefully insert it up through the nostril, tapping it with a small hammer to break through the thin ethmoid bone at the back of the nose, a fragile partition separating the nasal cavity from the cranium. Once inside the skull, the real work began. The hook was twisted and turned, like a whisk in a bowl, liquefying the brain tissue. The embalming table would be tilted, and the liquefied brain would simply drain out through the nose. Any remaining pieces were pulled out with the hook or dissolved with infusions of cedar oil, and spices poured into the empty cranial cavity. The head was now a hollow vessel, ready to be packed with resin-soaked linen. The four main organs that had been removed from the abdomen, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, were now placed under the protection of four minor gods, known as the four sons of Horus. Each son guarded a specific organ and was, in turn, protected by a specific goddess. The liver was protected by the human-headed Imsiti, the lungs by the baboon-headed Hapi, the stomach by the jackal-headed Duamutef, and the intestines by the falcon-headed Kabisanuf. These preserved organs were placed into four special containers we call canopic jars. The lids of these jars were carved into the heads of their corresponding guardian gods. These weren't just decorative storage pots. They were essential pieces of afterlife equipment. Without them, the deceased would be incomplete in the next world. They were a spiritual life support system, ensuring the functions of the body could be magically restored. So now, the scene in the Wabit is one of controlled chaos. The air is heavy with incense and the metallic tang of blood. The lector priest's chants echo off the tent walls. The body lies on the slab, washed, opened, and now hollowed out. The brain is gone, a forgotten slurry. The vital organs rest in their sacred jars, watched over by the carved faces of gods. The body cavity is a gaping void, rinsed with palm wine to disinfect it and packed with fragrant herbs and spices. It's an empty shell, a vessel that has been ritually emptied of all its earthly, corruptible contents. All of them, that is, except for one. Deep inside the chest cavity, nestled between the now empty lungs, the embalmers intentionally, carefully, and reverently left a single solitary organ. It was too important to remove, too powerful to be entrusted to a jar. It was the key to everything. It was the record of a person's entire life, the witness to every good deed and every dark secret. It was the one part of the body the soul would need to present to the gods as evidence of a life worth living. They left the heart. They left the heart, because in the vast, terrifying darkness of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, the heart was not just an organ. It was a witness. It was the scroll on which every thought, every word, and every deed was invisibly written. It was the one thing a soul could not lie about because it was the truth of their life, and it would be weighed. This was the ultimate trial, the final exam for eternity. After a perilous journey through the underworld, dodging serpents and demons, the soul of the deceased would arrive, guided by the jackal-headed god Anubis, at the Hall of Two Truths. Here, before a tribunal of 42 divine judges, The fate of the soul would be decided. In the center of the hall stood a great golden scale. On one side, Anubis would place the heart of the deceased. On the other, he would place a single pure white ostrich feather. This was the feather of Ma'at, the physical embodiment of truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. This was the moment of judgment. The scales would measure the weight of a life. But before they could be balanced, the deceased had to make a declaration. They had to stand before Osiris, the great god of the dead, enthroned in the hall, and recite the negative confession. This wasn't a confession of guilt, but a powerful declaration of innocence, a list of all the sins they had not committed. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not made anyone cry. The list went on, a moral code that governed their entire civilization. It wasn't just about avoiding murder and theft. Covered everything. I have not been boastful. I have not been deaf to the words of truth. I have not polluted the water. I have not acted with insolence. It was a profound accounting of a person's character, their compassion, their honesty, their respect for the divine and natural order. As they spoke these words, the heart on the scale reacted. If the person had lived a righteous life, a life in accordance with Ma'at, their heart would be light, unburdened by the heavy weight of sin. It would balance perfectly against the single delicate feather. The ibis-headed god Thoth, the divine scribe, would record the verdict. True of voice. The soul had passed the test. They were justified. They would be welcomed by Osiris into the field of reeds, or Aru, the Egyptian paradise. An eternal afterlife that was a perfect reflection of the Egypt they knew, but without pain, without hunger, and without death. A land of lush fields, abundant harvests, and reunion with loved ones who had passed before. It was everything they had ever hoped for. But what if the heart was heavy? What if it was weighed down by lies, by cruelty, by greed? What if the negative confession was a desperate, final lie? The scales would tip. The heart, black and heavy with transgression, would plummet, outweighed by the simple purity of a single feather. Thoth would record this verdict too. And then the soul would face the consequence. Crouched beside the scales, waiting with hungry patience, was a creature of nightmares. A terrifying beast the Egyptians called Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She was a composite monster, a terrifying fusion of the three most feared predators in their world. She had the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Ammit was not a demon to be fought or a god to be worshipped. She was an executioner, the final brutal end. When a heart failed the test, it was thrown from the scales directly to her. Ammit would devour it in a single gulp, and in that moment the soul was utterly and completely annihilated. This was the second death, the one from which there was no return. There was no hell, no eternal punishment. There was simply nothing. Oblivion, the end of existence itself. Your name would be forgotten, your memory erased, your consciousness extinguished for all time. For a people who dedicated their entire lives to achieving eternity, this was a fate more terrifying than any imaginable torment. So back in the embalmer's tent, under the desert sun, the priests worked with a profound understanding of their task. Leaving the heart in the chest wasn't a medical oversight. It was an act of faith. They were preserving the key to the soul's trial, the evidence for its eternal life. With the organs removed and the heart secured, the body was now a hollowed shell. But the greatest enemy of preservation was still present, lurking in every cell: water. Moisture is the fuel for decay. It's the breeding ground for the bacteria that would turn the body back into dust. To achieve eternity, the body had to be made as arid and lifeless as the desert itself. The Egyptians had the perfect tool for this, a gift from the very land they worshipped. It was a substance called natron, a naturally occurring salt, a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate that looked like coarse white crystals. They harvested it from dried-up lake beds, most famously from a valley called Wadi el Natron, or Natron Valley. This salt was a miracle desiccant. It was hypertonic, meaning it had an insatiable thirst for water. It would pull every last drop of moisture out of anything it touched. The process was simple, yet brutally effective. The embalmers would wash the body and the empty chest cavity one last time with palm wine to disinfect it. Then they brought in the natron, piles and piles of it. They laid the body on a slanted embalming bed, designed to let the fluids drain away, and they completely buried it in a mountain of this salt. They packed the inside of the body cavity with linen bags filled with natron, ensuring that the desiccation happened from the inside out as well as the outside in. And then they waited. This was not a quick process. It was a long, slow, sacred period of transformation. For 40 days, the body lay entombed in salt. 40 days. This number was no accident. It was deeply symbolic. To the ancient Egyptians, it was linked to the star Sirius, which they identified with the goddess Isis. For a period of about 70 days each year, Sirius would disappear from the night sky before spectacularly reappearing at dawn. The first 40 of these days were seen as a time of purification and renewal, a cosmic parallel to the body being purified in the natron. The body wasn't just drying out, it was undergoing a celestial transformation, aligning itself with the cycles of the gods and the stars. During these 40 days, the natron did its relentless work. It pulled the water from the skin, the muscles, the bones. It dissolved the body's fats, turning them into a soap-like substance, a process called saponification, which further aided in preservation. The body shrank, it darkened, it hardened. The skin became leathery, stretched taut over the skeleton. The features became gaunt and skeletal. It was a grotesque and dramatic change. By the end of the 40th day, what was left was no longer a soft, decaying corpse. It was a dry, sterile, and permanent human form, stripped of over 75% of its original weight. It was a blank canvas, purified and ready for the final, most intricate stage of its journey. The flesh had been conquered. Now it was time to make it divine. The priests would now begin a process that could take another 15 days, a sacred art form known as wrapping. This wasn't merely about covering the body. This was an act of recreation. They were building a new, eternal body around the old one. A divine shell, a spiritual armor for the perilous journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The material for this divine armor was linen, staggering amounts of it. For a royal burial, it could be over 400 square yards of the finest fabric, enough to cover 3/4 of a basketball court. This linen wasn't just random cloth. It was often donated by the family, sometimes consisting of old household linens, worn and softened by life, carrying the very essence of the home with them into eternity. Other times, it was specially woven fabric from temple workshops, imbued with purity from the moment of its creation. The head and neck were wrapped first, with strips of fine linen. Then the most intricate work began, the fingers and the toes. Each digit was wrapped individually with painstaking care. Imagine a team of priests, their hands moving with practiced reverence, chanting incantations as they delicately encase each finger, each toe, in its own cocoon of linen. This wasn't for practicality, it was for identity. In the afterlife, the deceased needed to be whole. They needed to be able to grasp the scepter of power, to walk the fields of Aru. Every part of their human form had to be preserved and defined, locked into its perfect shape. Once the extremities were secured, the arms and legs were wrapped separately. Pads of linen were used to ensure a natural, lifelike contour. The goal was never to create a shapeless bundle. It was to sculpt a statue, an idealized human form that would never decay. The limbs were often positioned in a specific symbolic pose. For a pharaoh, the arms would be crossed over the chest, holding the symbolic crook and flail, the emblems of kingship and the power of Osiris, the god of the dead. But this was more than just linen. Between these layers of fabric, the priests would place the true source of the mummy's power: the amulets. These were not mere decorations. They were magical batteries, holy talismans charged with divine energy, each with a specific and vital purpose. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of them would be tucked into the wrappings, forming a grid of spiritual protection. The most important of all was placed directly over the heart. This was the heart scarab, carved from a dark green or black stone. This amulet in the shape of a sacred beetle was the deceased's ultimate insurance policy. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, the record of a person's entire life. During the final judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, the heart would be weighed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would outweigh the feather, and the soul would be devoured by the monster Ammit, ceasing to exist forever. The heart scarab was a magical failsafe. Inscribed on its underside was a spell from the Book of the Dead, Spell 30b. It was a direct command to the heart itself, an appeal from the deceased. "O my heart which I had from my mother! O my heart of my different ages! Do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." It was a spell to silence one's own conscience, to prevent the heart from betraying its owner at the most critical moment in its existence. Another crucial amulet was the jet pillar, a symbol representing the backbone of the god Osiris. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, his spine was the first part to be reassembled by his wife Isis, allowing for his eventual resurrection. Placing the jet pillar amulet along the mummy's own spine was a powerful act of sympathetic magic. It was meant to channel the regenerative power of Osiris directly into the deceased, ensuring their own body would remain stable, enduring, and capable of resurrection in the afterlife. The ankh, the famous symbol of life, was often placed in the mummy's hand or on the chest. It wasn't just a general wish for life, but a symbol of the divine breath, the very essence that separated the living from the dead. The Tayat, or the knot of Isis, was another powerful protective amulet, often made of red jasper or carnelian to represent the goddess's blood. It was placed on the upper torso, invoking the protective magic of the most powerful goddess in the pantheon. And then there was the Ujjat, the Eye of Horus. According to myth, the god Horus lost his eye in a battle with his uncle Set. The eye was magically restored by Thoth, the god of wisdom. The Ujjat amulet, therefore, symbolized healing, restoration, and protection. Placed upon the mummy, it was a ward against all evil, a guarantee that any damage sustained in life or death would be made whole again. As the layers of linen and amulets built up, the priests would begin to apply a thick, dark, viscous liquid, resin. This warm, sticky substance, often derived from coniferous trees, served multiple purposes. On a practical level, it was a powerful adhesive, gluing the linen strips together and making the wrappings waterproof and airtight. As it cooled and hardened, it transformed the soft bandages into a rigid, protective carapace, like an insect's chrysalis, safeguarding the body from moisture and pests. But its symbolic meaning was even more profound. The black color of the resin was linked to the rich, fertile silt of the Nile River, the source of all life in Egypt. It was also the color of Osiris, the lord of the underworld. By coating the mummy in this black resin, they were symbolically equating the deceased with the god of resurrection, steeping them in the promise of rebirth. The entire mummy was being turned into a vessel of Osirian power. Finally, after layer upon layer of linen, amulets, and resin, the body was completely encased. Its human features were gone, hidden beneath a sculpted form. The identity of the person within was now obscured. And so the final and most visually stunning element was added: the mask. For a common person, this might be a simple cartonnage mask, made from layers of linen or papyrus stiffened with plaster and then painted. But for a king, it was a masterpiece of gold and precious stones. The Mask of Tutankhamun is the ultimate example. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a transfiguration. The mask depicted the deceased not as they were in death, but as an idealized divine being. The gold skin was the skin of the gods. The lapis lazuli hair was the hair of the gods. The false beard identified the king with Osiris. The mask was the new face of the deceased, the face they would present to the gods in the afterlife. It was a permanent, unchanging visage of divinity that ensured the gods would recognize them, welcome them, and accept them as one of their own. With the mask in place, the mummy was wrapped in one final large shroud, often painted with figures of Osiris and other protective deities. This outer shell was secured with several long linen bands running horizontally and vertically from head to toe. The body was now a sa, a sacred and glorified object. It was no longer a corpse. It was an effigy, a divine statue containing the preserved physical form of the deceased. The 15-day ritual of wrapping was complete. The vessel for the soul was now sealed, protected, and divinely charged. It was a masterpiece of faith and fear, a perfect human-shaped container ready for eternity. But a vessel, no matter how perfect, needs a home. The body was now safe, but the sa itself needed protection for its long, dark sleep. The next stage of the journey would involve enclosing it within a series of even more elaborate, even more powerful containers. The wrapping had protected the flesh. Now they had to protect the mummy itself. This protection began with a final intimate layer, one that would become the most iconic image of ancient Egypt itself: the death mask. This wasn't just a portrait. It was a magical replacement, an idealized and eternal face for the soul, or Ba, to recognize when it returned to the body each night. If the mummy's actual head were ever damaged or destroyed, the mask would serve as an infallible substitute, ensuring the Ba would never be lost, wandering aimlessly without its physical anchor. For a common person, this might be a simple mask made of cartonnage, a kind of ancient papier-mâché made from linen or papyrus strips mixed with plaster. It would be painted with a serene, youthful face, a generic but hopeful image of rebirth. But for a pharaoh, the mask was a masterpiece of divine craftsmanship. Think of Tutankhamun. His mask isn't just gold. It's a vessel of theology. The solid gold itself represented the flesh of the gods, eternal and incorruptible. The blue stripes of his headdress, made from priceless lapis lazuli, mimicked the divine hair of the deities. The vulture and cobra on his brow, the goddesses Nekhbet and Wadjet, symbolized his dominion over both Upper and Lower Egypt, a power he would carry with him into eternity. Staring into those obsidian and quartz eyes, you are looking at the face of a god, an image of perfection designed to last forever. With the mask in place, the wrapped and anointed body was ready for its first true enclosure, the coffin. This was far more than a simple box. The earliest coffins were rectangular, meant to resemble a house for the dead. But by the time of the New Kingdom, they had evolved into the familiar anthropoid or human-shaped form. This design was critical. Just like the mask was a substitute head, the coffin was a substitute body, a perfect, indestructible, and divinely charged shell. It was an idealized version of the deceased, forever young, forever healthy, forever ready to be reborn. The materials themselves were steeped in meaning. In a land where large trees were scarce, wood was a luxury. The most common was native sycamore fig, a tree sacred to the goddesses Nut and Hathor, who were both associated with rebirth. For the wealthy, however, nothing but the best would do. They imported massive logs of cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, a fragrant and durable wood whose scent was believed to be divine, a perfume that repelled decay and pleased the gods. The construction was a master craft, with planks carefully shaped and joined together, creating a seamless human form. But the true magic was on the surface. The entire coffin was a canvas for a complex tapestry of protective spells and divine imagery. It was, in essence, a magical machine. The lid was often adorned with a sculpted face, again, an idealized portrait, but the body was covered in a riot of color and symbols. You would find the great protective goddesses, Isis and Nephthys, often depicted with their winged arms outstretched, shielding the body within. The four sons of Horus, the guardians of the internal organs we met earlier, were painted along the sides, continuing their eternal vigil. And everywhere, in every available space, were columns of intricate hieroglyphs. These weren't just prayers, they were potent spells, cheat codes for the afterlife, copied directly from sacred texts like the Book of the Dead. They provided the deceased with the magic words needed to overcome demonic gatekeepers, to answer the riddles of the gods, and to successfully navigate the treacherous landscape of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The coffin wasn't just holding a body. It was actively working to ensure its successful resurrection. For the truly powerful, one coffin was never enough. The concept of protection was layered, a series of nested magical barriers. This led to the creation of nests of coffins, each one fitting perfectly inside the last like a set of Russian dolls. Each layer added another shell of magical and physical defense. A high-ranking official might have 2 or 3 coffins. The innermost one might be intricately painted, the next one covered in gold leaf, and the outer one larger and more robust. For a pharaoh like Tutankhamun, this reached an almost unimaginable extreme. His mummy was placed inside 3 separate human-shaped coffins. The first 2 were crafted from wood, covered in shimmering gold leaf and inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones. But the third, innermost coffin, the one that directly cradled the royal mummy, was made from over 240 pounds of solid hammered gold. It was the ultimate statement of divine status, a body for a god, encased in the very substance of the gods. Yet, even this breathtaking nest of golden coffins wasn't the final layer. The entire assembly, mummy, mask, and multiple coffins, was destined for one last monumental container, the sarcophagus. The word sarcophagus comes to us from the Greeks and grimly means flesh eater, from their belief that the limestone they used for their coffins would rapidly consume the body. The Egyptians would have been horrified by this term. To them, this great stone box was Nebank, meaning the Lord of Life, because its entire purpose was to protect and generate life eternal. The sarcophagus was the ultimate defense. It was the fortress wall against which the forces of chaos would break. Carved from a single colossal block of the hardest stones, red granite from Aswan, deep black basalt, or luminous white alabaster, it was a monument to permanence. These were materials born from the bedrock of Egypt itself, imbued with the stability and endurance of the mountains. A finished sarcophagus could weigh many tons, an object so massive and so solid it seemed to defy time itself. Getting it into the burial chamber, often deep beneath the earth at the end of a narrow corridor, was one of the greatest engineering challenges of the entire funeral. And like the coffins it contained, the sarcophagus was a magical engine. Its vast flat surfaces were the perfect canvas for even more elaborate texts and scenes. Entire chapters of the Amduat, that which is in the underworld, might be carved into its interior walls, providing the deceased with a complete map and guide to the 12 hours of the night, the journey they would take with the sun god Ra towards rebirth at dawn. The exterior was often shaped to resemble a shrine and was covered in inscriptions declaring the deceased's name and titles, lists of offerings to sustain them, and powerful protective spells that formed an impenetrable magical barrier. It was the final seal, the outer shell of a sacred vessel designed to carry its precious cargo across the ocean of eternity. From the linen bandages to the golden mask, from the nested coffins to the granite sarcophagus, the body was now encased in a multi-layered fortress of art, wealth, and powerful magic. It was a perfect, self-contained universe, ready for its final journey. But this vessel now needed a harbor, a permanent home that was far more than just a grave. It needed a machine for resurrection, an eternal palace equipped for a life beyond death. The ancient Egyptians didn't just build tombs, they built engines for eternity. We think of a grave as an endpoint, a final resting place. For them it was the exact opposite. It was a starting point, a launch pad, a complex magical machine designed with a single breathtaking purpose: to guarantee the resurrection of the soul and sustain it for millions of years. And like any critical piece of technology, its design and location were matters of life and, well, life after death. For over 1,000 years, the pharaohs had announced their eternal homes to the world with colossal pyramids, giant stone arrows pointing to the stars. But these magnificent structures had a fatal flaw. They were advertisements. They screamed to the heavens, "The greatest treasure in the land is buried right here." And for 1,000 years, tomb robbers had answered the call, plundering nearly every single one. The Pyramid Age ended not because they couldn't build them, but because they couldn't protect them. A new strategy was needed: secrecy. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom looked to the west bank of Thebes, to a desolate, sun-scorched valley, a place of profound silence guarded by a mountain that itself looked like a natural pyramid. They would call it Tasekitma, the Great Field. We call it the Valley of the Kings. Here they would not build up, they would dig down. They would hide their eternal machines deep within the living rock, burying the entrances, erasing the footprints, and entrusting their souls to the secrecy of the earth itself. But this was far more than just digging a hole. The architecture of a royal tomb was a physical map of the soul's cosmic journey. To enter one was to walk the path the pharaoh's spirit was meant to take. It began with a long, steep staircase descending into the darkness, a symbolic plunge into the underworld, the Duat. This led to a series of corridors, each one a stage of the journey, sloping ever downward into the heart of the mountain. These weren't hallways, they were portals. Some had sharp turns designed to confuse evil spirits, or perhaps tomb robbers who might try to follow. Others contained deep pits or false chambers, spiritual and physical dead ends for the unworthy. Finally, after this disorienting descent, you would arrive in the antechamber. This was the celestial waiting room. Here, the final preparations were made, the last rites performed. It was a space on the very threshold between worlds. And beyond it lay the heart of the entire machine, the destination of the funeral procession and the starting point for the soul, the burial chamber. The Egyptians called it the House of Gold, not just for the treasures it contained, but because it was here in this sacred space that the deceased would be transformed, reborn as a god shining like the sun. But the tomb structure was just the hardware. To make the machine work, it needed software. and that software was written on every single surface. The walls and ceilings of these tombs were not decorated. They were activated, covered from top to bottom in the most intricate, vibrant paintings and hieroglyphs. These were not art for art's sake. This was functional magic. These texts were the instruction manuals, the guidebooks, the cosmic GPS for the soul's perilous journey. Imagine waking up after death in total darkness, disoriented, with no idea where to go or what to do. The tomb walls provided the answers. They were covered in sacred texts like the Book of Gates, or the Amduat, literally, that which is in the underworld. These books laid out the entire journey, hour by hour. They described the terrifying demons the pharaoh would face, snake-headed creatures and monsters with knives for hands, and provided the magic spells needed to defeat them. They depicted the gods who would help him, and the specific words he needed to say to gain their favor. It was a cheat code for the afterlife. One of the most crucial scenes, painted in vivid detail, was the weighing of the heart. The pharaoh's heart, the seat of his intelligence and conscience, would be placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. If his heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by a terrifying crocodile-headed monster named Ammit, the devourer of the dead, and his soul would cease to exist forever. But if his heart was as light as the feather, he was declared true of voice and worthy to proceed. By painting this scene on the wall, the Egyptians weren't just hoping for a good outcome. They were using sympathetic magic to ensure it. The image made it real. The machine was programmed for success. With the hardware built and the software installed, the machine now needed fuel. It needed to be stocked with everything the pharaoh would require to live a life of eternal luxury, identical to the one he had enjoyed on Earth. This is where the legendary grave goods come in. We see the glitter of gold, but the Egyptians saw a divine substance, the skin of the gods, imperishable and eternal. Tutankhamun was buried with over 200 pounds of it, fashioned into his coffins, his mask, his jewelry. But the treasure was more than just wealth. There were chests filled with fine linen clothing, from everyday kilts to ceremonial robes. There were ornate, gilded beds and chairs to furnish his afterlife palace. There were alabaster jars still containing traces of wine and oils, and boxes of preserved meats and breads, because a king still needs to feast. There were board games like the popular game of Senet, so he would never be bored. They even included the pharaoh's personal chariots, disassembled and carefully packed away, ready for him to ride across the fields of the blessed. But perhaps the most ingenious provisions were the shaptis. These were small mummiform figurines, hundreds of them, placed in the tomb. In the Egyptian afterlife, everyone, even a pharaoh, was expected to perform manual labor, to till the fields and maintain the canals in the domain of the god Osiris. The pharaoh, of course, had no intention of doing such work. So the shaptis were enchanted to be his magical servants. A spell inscribed on them reads, "O Shapti, if I am called upon to do any work, you shall present yourself, saying, 'Here I am.'" When the pharaoh was called, these figurines would magically spring to life and do the work for him, leaving the king free to enjoy his eternal paradise. They packed an army of magical robots. Every single object was catalogued, consecrated, and carefully placed in its designated spot within the treasury rooms adjoining the burial chamber. The entire tomb was a perfect, self-sufficient microcosm of Egypt itself, a self-contained world ready to be sealed off from ours forever. Once the mummy was placed in its sarcophagus in the House of Gold, and the last of the grave goods were stored, the final ceremony began. Priests chanted the last incantations, wafting incense through the corridors. The stone masons who had cut the tomb from the rock now became its guardians, walling up the doorways between each chamber, plastering over the stones to hide the seams. They worked their way backward, out of the tomb, sealing the pharaoh into his new reality. Finally, they reached the entrance. The last great stone block was slid into place. It was plastered, and while the plaster was still wet, officials would press their seals into it. The royal necropolis seal showing the jackal god Anubis crouching over 9 bound captives, representing the enemies of Egypt. This was the final lock. It was a declaration that this space was now sacred, protected by the state and by the gods. The workers would then bury the entrance under tons of limestone chips and rubble, disguising it, making it look like any other patch of barren valley floor. And then silence. Deep within the mountain, the machine was now sealed. The engine was primed. The pharaoh was alone in the darkness, but he was not dead. He was at the starting line of the greatest journey imaginable, armed with magic, surrounded by treasure, his body perfectly preserved. The launch sequence was complete. Now his spirit had to awaken and begin its terrifying, magnificent voyage through the underworld. For the deceased there is no sound, no light, only the silent, velvet blackness of the sealed tomb. But this is not an ending. It is a metamorphosis. A profound change begins not in the flesh but in the spirit. A flicker, then a stirring. The BA, the very essence of the person's soul, their personality and character, awakens. It is depicted as a human-headed bird, a perfect symbol for a spirit untethered, ready for flight. Imagine this moment. The BA separates from the physical form, rising like smoke from a quenched flame. It is weightless, ethereal. It passes through the solid gold of the sarcophagus, through the stone of the tomb as if they were mist. For the first time it sees its own earthly vessel, the mummy, lying in state, a perfect inanimate statue. It recognizes the face, the body it inhabited for a lifetime. But there's no sense of loss, only purpose. This body is an anchor, a home to which it must be able to return each night. The mummification wasn't just to preserve a corpse. It was to maintain a permanent, recognizable beacon for the soul in the physical world. But the BA is not the complete spirit. Another part, the Ka, awaits. The Ka is the life force, the vital spark, the spiritual twin that was born with every person and has been dwelling in the tomb, sustained by the offerings of food and drink. Now in the darkness, these two essential parts of the soul must find each other. The BA, with its personality and consciousness, unites with the Ka, the divine energy. This fusion creates something new, something greater. The Ak. The Ak is a radiant, effective spirit, a being of light, fully equipped to not just survive the underworld, but to triumph over it. The newly formed Ak is now a complete entity, powerful and aware. Its first task is to leave the tomb, not by breaking the seal, but by passing through the false door, a special stone carving on the tomb wall that serves as a portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead. For the spirit, this door is as real as any other. It steps through and does not find the familiar sands of Egypt. It finds itself at the edge of the world on the western horizon, where the sun god Ra begins his own nightly journey. The spirit has entered the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and it is nothing like the empty void one might imagine. It is a complex, terrifying, and structured reality. Think of it as a parallel dimension, a landscape of deserts, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling water, and hidden cavers. It is a realm governed by strict rules and populated by gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead. The entire Duat is divided into 12 sections, representing the 12 hours of the night. The deceased, like the sun god Ra, must travel through all 12 hours, from sunset to sunrise, to be reborn in the morning. This is not a peaceful stroll. It is an ordeal. The path is blocked by a series of massive gates, each one guarded by a terrifying entity. These are not simple guards. They are chthonic horrors, nightmare creatures whose sole purpose is to deny passage to the unworthy. The first gate is guarded by a serpent-headed demon named He, whose face is turned backwards. To pass, the deceased cannot use force. They must use knowledge. They must know the secret name of the gate itself, and the name of the guardian. This is where the immense preparation pays off. The spirit is armed with the spells and passwords inscribed on the papyrus of the Book of the Dead, which was wrapped within their mummy bandages. This scroll is not a book of stories. It is a divine cheat sheet, a supernatural GPS for the afterlife. The Ak approaches the first gate. The serpent-headed guardian rises, brandishing a knife, its voice a dry hiss. The spirit must recite the correct incantation, flawlessly. I know you and I know your name. You are he who swallows all. The name of your gate is Mistress of Fear. Upon speaking the correct words, the guardian recoils. The massive gate swings open. The spirit passes through, only to find the landscape of the second hour of the night, and soon a second gate. This one is guarded by a creature named Swallower of Sinners, and the gate itself is called Lord of Slaughter. Again, the spirit must consult its magical knowledge and speak the names of power. And so it continues hour after hour, gate after gate. The guardians become progressively more monstrous. There are beings with the bodies of men and the heads of crocodiles, jackals, or scarab beetles. There is the blood drinker who comes from the slaughter block, and the one who eats the excrement of his hind parts. These are not metaphors. To the ancient Egyptians, these were real beings the soul would have to face. Each one is a test, not of strength but of purity and preparation. To forget a name, to stumble over a single word of a spell, means annihilation. To be devoured by one of these guardians is to die the second death, to be erased from existence entirely. But the journey is not just a gauntlet of monsters. The Duat is also a place of cosmic processes. As the spirit travels, it witnesses the sun god Ra's own journey on his great solar bark, battling the forces of chaos. The deceased's goal is to join Ra on that boat, to become one of his crew, and thus ensure their own daily rebirth. In some hours of the night, the underworld is a place of rejuvenation. The spirit might pass through fields where the blessed dead live in a perfect reflection of Egypt, the field of reeds. They might see the sun god's light bring temporary relief to those being punished in fiery pits, a moment of reprieve in an eternity of torment. They see the fundamental machinery of the universe, the struggle between order and chaos, personified by Ra and his great enemy, the serpent Apep. Every night, Apep tries to swallow the sun boat and plunge the universe into eternal darkness. Every night, Ra and his divine defenders, including gods like Set and the spirits of the worthy dead, fight him off, ensuring the sun can rise again. The deceased soul is not just a tourist here. They are a participant in this cosmic battle. Their own journey is a reflection of this grand struggle. By conquering the demons of the Duat, they are helping to maintain the order of the cosmos itself. As the spirit navigates this treacherous and wondrous realm, passing through the first few gates, a sense of grim determination sets in. They have proven their knowledge of the secret names. They have faced down creatures of nightmare and have not faltered. They have shown they are worthy of proceeding. But the early tests, the Gate Guardians, were merely a screening process. They were designed to weed out the ignorant and the unprepared. A far greater challenge looms ahead, one that cannot be bypassed with a magic word or a secret name. The spirit is now approaching the 4th and 5th hours of the night, a strange and winding region of the Duat known as the Kingdom of Sokar, a primeval god of the underworld. The path becomes a difficult, sandy desert, and the solar bark itself transforms into a serpent boat to navigate the treacherous terrain. Ahead, shrouded in shadow and silence, lies the Hall of Two Truths, the divine courtroom where the ultimate judgment will be rendered. The guardians of the gates were a test of memory. What comes next is a test of morality. His heart, the very record of his life, the seat of his conscience and intelligence, was about to be weighed against a single pure white feather. And a monstrous creature, a terrifying hybrid of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, Ammit, the devourer of the dead, was waiting, crouched and hungry, for the verdict. This is the final test, the culmination of a lifetime, condensed into a single terrifying moment. The soul stands in the vast, echoing Hall of Two Truths, a cavernous chamber lit by an otherworldly glow. 42 divine judges, with the heads of animals and the bodies of men, sit in silent judgment, their eyes piercing the very essence of the newcomer. Before them, the great golden scales, held steady by the jackal-headed god Anubis, the divine embalmer and guide of the dead. And on the throne, swathed in white linen, holding the crook and flail, sits the majestic, silent figure of Osiris, Lord of the underworld, King of the dead. His green skin, a symbol of rebirth and regeneration, offers no hint of the verdict to come. The air is thick with the scent of incense and eternity. There is no sound but the frantic, silent beating of the soul's own spiritual heart, the IB, which has just been placed on one of the golden pans of the scale. On the other pan, Anubis gently places the single weightless-looking feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. This is not a test of knowledge or strength. It is a measure of morality, a life's worth of deeds, thoughts, and intentions, all weighed against the purest concept of truth in the universe. But before the scales can tip, before the final judgment is rendered, the deceased must speak. They must perform the negative confession. Facing the 42 judges, they must declare their innocence, addressing each deity and proclaiming a sin they did not commit. This is their one and only chance to plead their case. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not been deceitful. I have not uttered lies. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not been angry without just cause. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not polluted the water. I have not fouled the land. The list goes on, a litany of purity, a final desperate appeal to the cosmic order. Each denial is a weight lifted, a hope that their heart remains light, unburdened by the heavy residue of guilt and wrongdoing. All the while, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, stands ready with his scribe's palette, prepared to record the final outcome for all of eternity. And at the foot of the scales, the monster Ammit shifts her weight, her crocodile snout sniffing the air, her lion's mane bristling, her hippopotamus hindquarters tense to spring. Her hungry eyes never leave the balance. Then the confession is over. A profound silence descends upon the hall. Anubis steps back. The scales are released. Slowly, agonizingly, the golden pans begin to move. They tremble, swaying up and down as the universe itself holds its breath. The soul watches, its entire existence hanging on this delicate, terrifying dance. Will a lifetime of small kindnesses, of quiet integrity be enough? Or will a single act of malice, a moment of greed, a secret lie, be the stone that drags them down into oblivion? Imagine the terror if the scale begins to tip the wrong way. The pan holding the heart sinks, weighed down by sin, demonstrably heavier than the feather of truth. A gasp echoes through the hall, not from the gods but from the soul itself. The judgment is instantaneous and irreversible. Thoth makes a single, damning mark on his scroll. Osiris gives a silent, solemn nod. And Ammit, the devourer, leaps. There is no appeal, no second chance. The creature's powerful jaws, lined with crocodile teeth, snap shut on the guilty heart. In a single horrific moment, the heart, the seat of the soul's identity, intelligence, and life force, is devoured. But this is not merely death. This is something far, far worse. This is the second death. The soul is not sent to a hell of fire and torment. It is simply unmade, annihilated, erased from existence as if it had never been. All the work of the embalmers, all the prayers of the priests, all the love of their family, all of it is for nothing. They are cast into the cosmic void. Their name forgotten, their spirit extinguished forever. It is the ultimate horror for an ancient Egyptian, eternal non-existence. But what if the scales balance? What if, after a life lived with honor and integrity, the heart is found to be as light and pure as the feather of Ma'at? The golden pans sway and then settle perfectly level. The heart has passed the test. A wave of unimaginable relief washes over the soul. Thoth smiles, dips his reed pen in ink, and writes the glorious verdict. Makeru, true of voice, justified. Ammit lets out a disappointed growl and slinks back into the shadows, her hunger unsated for now. The 42 judges nod in approval. Anubis gently takes the justified heart from the scale and returns it to the soul. And then the great god Horus, son of Osiris, with the head of a falcon and the eyes of the sun and moon, steps forward. He takes the justified soul by the hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and leads them forward, out of the hall of judgment and towards the great throne of his father. They stand before Osiris, the king who conquered death itself. The soul, now vindicated and pure, is presented to the Lord of the afterlife. Osiris, the silent judge, now becomes the welcoming king. He accepts them into his kingdom, no longer a defendant, but a blessed citizen of the underworld. Their name is now spoken with reverence, their place in eternity secured. They have triumphed over death and judgment. They have earned their paradise. And what a paradise it is! The soul is guided to the final destination, Aru, the field of reeds. This isn't some abstract heaven of clouds and angels. To the Egyptians, it was a perfected, idealized version of the world they knew and loved. It was an eternal Egypt. Here, the Nile never floods disastrously and never runs dry. The sun is always warm. The breeze is always gentle. The fields are lush and green, yielding harvests of wheat and barley that grow impossibly tall, far taller than any mortal could grow. Here there is no sickness, no pain, no aging, no sorrow. The soul is reunited with loved ones who passed the test before them. Parents, spouses, children, all restored to the prime of their lives, healthy and happy. They can spend eternity doing all the things they loved in life. They can hunt in the marshes, fish in the bountiful streams, feast at grand banquets with the gods, play games of senate, or simply lie in the shade of a sycamore tree with those they love. They are given a plot of land to tend, not as a chore, but as a joyous act of creation, ensuring they will never go hungry. The food and drink are more delicious than anything on earth. The beer flows freely, the bread is always fresh. It is a life of eternal, blissful, sun-drenched peace and abundance. This was the ultimate goal. This was why the body had to be so perfectly preserved, why every ritual was so vital. It was all to reach this perfect, unchanging paradise, to live forever as a blessed spirit in the field of reeds. But paradise was not a gift freely given, even to the justified. It was a destination that still had to be reached. And the path from the hall of judgment to the field of reeds was not a simple stroll. It was a perilous journey in itself, a final voyage through the twisting, dangerous landscapes of the underworld. And that path was guarded by demons, gates of fire, and serpents of chaos. The final journey, it turned out, had only just begun. To navigate this terrifying realm, the deceased was not left entirely alone. They were given a guide, the most important tool for survival in the afterlife. A collection of spells, hymns, and instructions we now call the Book of the Dead. But this name is a modern invention. The Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It wasn't a single book, but a personalized scroll, a cheat sheet for the soul buried with the mummy. Each scroll was unique, containing the spells the owner thought they would need most, or more accurately, the spells they could afford. The wealthy had lavishly illustrated papyri, while a poorer individual might have just a few key incantations. This scroll was the soul's GPS, its weapon, and its passport through the underworld, known as the Duat. The journey began on the solar bark of the sun god, Ra. Each night, Ra sailed through the 12 hours of darkness, the 12 regions of the Duat, and the soul of the deceased hoped to join him on this voyage. But this was no pleasure cruise. The Duat was a realm of chaos, populated by grotesque demons and monsters intent on destroying the soul and preventing Ra's boat from rising in the east, which would plunge the world into eternal darkness. The most fearsome of these was Apep, a colossal serpent of pure chaos, who lurked in the waters of the underworld. Every night, Apep would attack Ra's boat, and every night, the gods and the worthy dead aboard would have to fight him off, using magic and spears to ensure the sun would rise again. The soul had to prove its worth by helping to repel this ultimate evil. But even beyond Apep, the path was treacherous. The Duat was divided by a series of massive gates, typically 12, each guarded by a terrifying entity. These weren't friendly gatekeepers. They were knife-wielding demons with names like He Who Lives on Snakes or Blood Drinker from the Slaughterhouse. To pass, the soul couldn't use force. It had to use knowledge. It had to know the secret name of the gate itself and the name of the guardian demon. This is where the Book of the Dead was indispensable. It provided the exact words, the magical passwords, to appease these sentinels and be granted passage. Imagine standing before a towering gate of fire, a monstrous being blocking your path, and your entire existence depends on reciting a single perfect phrase learned from a scroll you read in life. One mistake and you could be annihilated. The soul would also face trials that tested its moral character. It would encounter lakes of fire, which the righteous could cross unharmed while the wicked were consumed. It would be accosted by demons who would try to trap it, steal its memories or even its name, for to lose your name in the Duat was to cease to exist. Spells from the Book of the Dead offered protection, creating magical shields or allowing the soul to transform into powerful animals, like a falcon or a swallow, to evade danger. It was a constant, exhausting battle of wits and will, a spiritual obstacle course designed to filter out all but the most prepared and worthy souls. After passing through all the gates, after repelling the forces of chaos and proving their knowledge, the soul arrived at its final destination, the place where its ultimate fate would be decided, the Hall of Two Truths. This was the courtroom of the gods. Here the deceased would stand before the great god Osiris, lord of the underworld, seated on his magnificent throne. But Osiris was not the only judge. Arrayed before him were 42 other divine judges, each one representing a specific sin, and it was here that the soul had to make its final plea, a moment known as the negative confession. This wasn't a confession of sins committed, but a declaration of sins not committed. Facing each of the 42 judges in turn, the soul had to state its innocence. The Book of the Dead provided the script. I have not committed sin, the soul would begin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not uttered lies. I have not been angry without just cause. I have not polluted the water. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not made anyone weep. The list goes on, a fascinating window into ancient Egyptian morality. It condemns not just major crimes like murder and theft, but also social evils like gossip, arrogance, and causing pain to others. The soul had to declare its purity, its adherence to Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. But words, even sacred words from a scroll, were not enough. The gods required proof. And this led to the single most critical, most terrifying moment of the entire journey. As the soul finished its declaration of innocence, it was led by the jackal-headed god Anubis to the center of the hall. There stood a great golden scale. This was the final test, the weighing of the heart. Anubis, the divine embalmer who had prepared the body for its journey, now acted as the arbiter of the soul. He would gently take the deceased's heart, the very same heart that was carefully left inside the mummy, the vessel of intelligence, emotion, and conscience, and place it on one side of the scale. On the other side, he would place a single, pure white ostrich feather. This was the feather of Ma'at, the physical manifestation of truth and justice. The entire hall would fall silent. The 42 judges, Osiris and Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, all watched, waiting. Thoth stood ready with his scribe's palette, prepared to record the final verdict. The principle was simple, but the stakes were absolute. For the soul to be declared worthy of eternal life, its heart had to be lighter than the feather. It had to be unburdened by the weight of sin, lies, and wrongdoing. A life lived in accordance with Ma'at would result in a light heart. A life of wickedness, deceit, and chaos would weigh it down. The soul could do nothing now but watch as the balance beam began to quiver. Everything, the elaborate mummification, the expensive tomb, the perilous journey through the duat, the recitation of 100 spells, all of it came down to this one silent, agonizing moment. And what if the heart was heavy? What if, despite the negative confession, the scale tipped? Waiting beside the scales, hungry and patient, was a creature of nightmares. A grotesque chimera with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Her name was Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She was not a goddess to be worshipped, but a demon to be feared, the embodiment of divine retribution. If the scales tipped, if the heart was found heavy with sin, there was no appeal, no second chance. Thoth would record the damning verdict, and Ammit would lunge forward to devour the heart. For the soul, this was not just death. This was the ultimate end. To have your heart eaten by Ammit meant you ceased to exist. You were denied an afterlife and cast into oblivion. Your consciousness erased from the cosmos for all eternity. It was the second and final death, the one from which there was no return. And as the soul of our ancient Egyptians stood there, watching the scale, the beam began to move, teetering between eternal paradise and absolute annihilation. The silence in the Hall of Two Truths is absolute, broken only by the faint metallic groan of the golden beam. For our soul, this single moment stretches into an eternity of its own. Every good deed, every whispered lie, every act of kindness, and every moment of selfishness presses down on the scales. The 42 gods who have listened to the negative confessions watch, their animal and human faces impassive, their judgment held in perfect stillness. Anubis, the jackal-headed guide, keeps a steady hand near the scale, not to influence it, but to steady it once the final verdict is reached. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, poises his reed pen over his papyrus, ready to record the fate of this soul for all time. And then with a final, almost imperceptible tremor, the scale settles. The beam is perfectly level. The heart, the vessel of the soul's conscience, weighs exactly the same as the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and cosmic order. It is not a declaration of sinless perfection. The Egyptians were realists, they knew no one was perfect. It is a declaration of balance, of a life lived in harmony with truth, a life worthy of eternity. A collective, silent exhale seems to pass through the hall. The monstrous Ammit, the devourer of the dead, lets out a frustrated, guttural sigh and slinks back into the shadows, her hunger unquenched for now. She will wait for the next soul, the next heart heavy with sin. But this soul is not for her. Thoth dips his pen and writes. The judgment is recorded. The soul is declared Ma'keru, true of voice, justified. The great god Horus, son of Osiris, steps forward. His falcon eyes are filled not with judgment but with welcome. He takes our soul by the hand, a gesture of both guidance and acceptance, and leads them forward, toward the grand throne at the end of the hall. There sits the lord of the afterlife himself, Osiris. He is wrapped in the white linens of a mummy, a symbol of his own death and resurrection. He holds the crook and flail, the tools of kingship and fertility. His skin is green, the color of rebirth and new life. He looks upon the soul, and in his gaze is the wisdom of ages, the compassion of a God who has endured his own betrayal and death. He is not a fearsome judge, but a welcoming father. Horus presents the justified soul, announcing their name and their verdict, true of voice. Osiris nods his solemn approval. The test is over. The gates are open. The journey through the perilous underworld is complete. The soul is now free to enter Aru, the field of reeds. This is the Egyptian paradise, the ultimate destination that every single step of the mummification process was designed to reach. But it is not a heaven of fluffy clouds and eternal rest. It is a perfect, idealized reflection of the Egypt they knew and loved. The sun shines brighter, the Nile's waters are clearer and more life-giving. The crops grow taller and more bountiful than in any mortal harvest. There is no sickness, no sadness, no pain. Here, the soul is reunited with family and friends who passed before them. Parents, children, spouses. All who were also judged true of voice are there to greet them. It is a reunion of unimaginable joy, the ultimate reward for a life well lived and a journey well traveled. They can feast at eternal banquets, hunt in the lush marshes, and play the board game Senate not against death, but with their loved ones for simple pleasure. Yet there is still work to be done. The gods require labor in paradise, just as they did on earth. The fields must be plowed, the seeds sown, the harvest reaped. But this is where one of the most ingenious parts of the burial comes into play. Remember those little figurines placed in the tomb? The Shapti dolls? They were enchanted servants for the afterlife. When the soul is called upon to work, they can simply command a Shapti to answer for them, to perform the labor in their stead. With hundreds of these figures packed into their tomb, the deceased could enjoy an eternity of leisure, while their magical servants tended the perfect fields of paradise. And every single night, after a day spent in the blissful light of Aru, the soul's ba, its personality, its essence, would fly back from the field of reeds. It would journey back across the spiritual plane, seeking its anchor in the physical world. It would find its way back to the tomb, to the necropolis, and there it would locate its own preserved body, its mummy. It would reunite with its Ka, its life force which had never left the tomb. In the silent, cool darkness of the burial chamber, the soul would rest and recharge within its perfectly preserved human form, the form that the embalmers had worked so tirelessly to create. This nightly reunion was the entire point. Without the mummy, the ba would have no home to return to. It would become a lost, wandering spirit, unable to rest, unable to re-enter paradise. The body was the vessel, the anchor, the physical guarantee of an eternal spiritual life. Mummification wasn't just a tradition. It was the linchpin of their entire eternal existence. For 3,000 years, this sacred belief system, and the rituals that supported it defined Egyptian civilization. From the age of the pyramids to the reign of Cleopatra, the embalmers perfected their art, driven by one of the most powerful forces in human history, the hope of eternal life. But nothing, not even a civilization that measured its existence in millennia, lasts forever. Foreign powers came to rule the land of the Nile. The Persians, the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and finally the Romans. With them, they brought new gods, new philosophies, and new religions. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it offered a different promise of salvation, one based on faith in a single God, not on intricate rituals and a pantheon of deities. The old ways began to fade. The temples to Osiris and Anubis fell silent. The hieroglyphs that told the stories of the gods became a forgotten language. The sacred, secret knowledge of the embalmers, passed down through generations, was lost. By the 4th century AD, the practice of mummification, the central pillar of Egyptian culture for 30 centuries, had all but vanished. The tombs were sealed. The bodies lay in darkness, their purpose forgotten by the world above. For over 1,000 years they waited. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, a new age of curiosity and exploration dawned. Archaeologists and adventurers flocked to Egypt, drawn by tales of lost pharaohs and hidden treasures. They unearthed the great temples, deciphered the hieroglyphs, and opened the sealed tombs. And inside they found them, the mummies. At first, they were seen as curiosities, even as commodities. But soon, science revealed the true treasure they held. Through X-rays, CT scans, and DNA analysis, these ancient bodies began to tell their stories once more. We could learn what they ate, what diseases they suffered from, how they lived, and how they died. The mummy of Ramesses the Great revealed an old warrior riddled with arthritis and a tooth abscess that likely caused him immense pain. The body of Tutankhamun told a story of a young king with a clubfoot and a body weakened by malaria. The very ritual that was meant to give them eternal life in the next world ended up giving them a different kind of immortality in ours. They became time capsules of flesh and bone, direct physical links to a civilization that had long since turned to dust. The embalmers had built better than they knew. Their sacred art to preserve a soul for Osiris ended up preserving a history for all of humanity. In the end, the ancient Egyptian obsession with death was, in reality, a profound and desperate obsession with life. They loved their world, their families, their sun-drenched existence on the banks of the Nile so much that they could not bear the thought of it ending. They constructed the most elaborate, expensive, and enduring system for cheating death that the world has ever known. They built mountains of stone, covered walls with magic spells, and turned the human body into a timeless vessel, all in a magnificent 3,000-year-long struggle against the finality of the grave. They sought to make life, in all its vibrancy and joy, last for all eternity. And in a way, through the legacy they left behind, in the stories their mummies still tell us today, they succeeded.